Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum, Oregon's premier public affairs forum. I'm Sue Thomas, president of City Club, and I welcome you all. Those of you here at the Governor Hotel and those of you listening on OPB or KBPS radio or watching on Portland Community Media's CityNet 30. Thank you for joining City Club today on Friday, January 15th for this week's Friday Forum. I am thrilled to begin the meeting today with an announcement that as of the end of 2009, our generous members have committed over $300,000 in gifts and pledges to the club's research endowment. In doing so, they successfully met the challenge of the family of the late Ogden Beeman, a past president and champion of City Club research. His widow, Charlotte, is thrilled and has offered her matching funds of $100,000. City Club offers a sincere thank you to its members for showing such strong support for our research program. Would you please join me in thanking them? Today, two economists will share with us their outlook on the economic future of the region. But first, some announcements. In consideration of those sitting close to you and those in our radio and television audiences, I ask that anyone that has not yet done so to please silence your cell phones. As always, we offer our appreciation to our Friday Forum corporate sponsors whose generous financial support make these City Club luncheons possible. We are especially pleased to welcome to today's forum our sponsor, The Standard, and especially the Director of Public Relations, Bob Speltz. Bob, where are you? Thank you. Please join me in offering greetings and appreciation to all of our sponsors, The Standard, Stoll Reeves, and West Coast Bank. We greatly appreciate your support. If your company or firm would like to be a Friday Forum sponsor, please see City Club staff at the back of the room or call the City Club office. Though the Friday Forum is the club's best-known program, I'd like to remind everyone that we actually have a wide array of other programs and events. It's not too late, for example, to join the New Leaders Council tonight at their Curious Comedy event, where participants will enjoy an evening of comedy and will learn how laughter can lead to social change. Or join our Agora Committee tomorrow at the first of the Transition Perspectives movie series, which explores positive responses to the climate crisis and peak oil. You can learn more about these programs and others at our website at pdxcityclub.org. At next week's Friday Forum, Willamette University law professors Robin Morris Collin and Robert William Collin will talk about why race still matters when dealing with issues of sustainability and environmental justice. And now on to today's program. Though Oregon's economy is finally, if slowly, improving, the state continues to struggle. Oregonians face high unemployment, a sluggish housing market, and depending on the outcomes of the votes on Measures 66 and 67, a potential $700 million hole in the state budget. Today we will hear from two prominent economists on their forecasts for our regional and local economies. Our first speaker today is Tom Potiowsky. After receiving his PhD in economics from the University of Colorado, Tom joined the faculty at Portland State University and eventually became chair of the economics department. Tom was appointed as state economist in 1999, a post he served through 2006. He went back to PSU to teach until 2008, when he once again returned to the post of state economist. Tom was a member of the Governor's Council on Economic Advisors for 3 years prior to his appointment with the state. Tom currently serves as a state economist and director of Oregon's Office of Economic Analysis. Today's second speaker has, I think, the longest title of anyone I've ever welcomed. Timothy Dewey is the adjunct assistant professor and director of the Oregon Economic Forum in the Department of Economics at the University of Oregon. Tim received his PhD in economics from the University of Oregon in 1998. Following graduate school, Tim worked in Washington, D.C. for the United States Department of Treasury and then returned to the University of Oregon in 2002. He is the director of the Oregon Economic Forum and the author of the University of Oregon Index of Economic Indicators and the Central Oregon Business Index. And so without further ado, please help me welcome today's first speaker, Tom Potiowsky. Tom?
Thank you, Sue. And thank you for this opportunity to once again address the City Club of Portland. You have a very rich history of providing a forum for better understanding the issues of the day, and I hope to be able to contribute to that end. Now, in preparation for today, I've searched the internet for a theme to present really where we're at in our present economic situation. And after a lengthy search, I found it in the title of a 1960s cult classic by Richard Farina. Been down so long, it looks like up to me. Now, I will say that in my search, too, there's also a song by Nancy Sinatra and Lee Hazelwood with this title that's absolutely horrible. Instead, I'd recommend to you the Doors song, Been Down So Long, much, much better. But of course, what happens when you search Google for one piece of information, it takes you off in all sorts of other directions. So let me bring the directions back to the topic at hand. We have been down. We've been down since November of 2007, making this a very lengthy recession. Now, analysts are saying that the U.S. recession ended sometime late this summer. The third quarter of GDP was the first relatively decent growth we've seen in 2.5 years. So, given that the analysts believe that this recession ended last summer, unfortunately, we'll have to wait probably till this summer before the official group, which is the National Bureau of Economic Research, gives us the date for the end of the recession. Now, at state levels, there is no official group or office that dates recessions. Given that no official committee exists, I declare that the recession in Oregon ended on September 23rd at 2:43 p.m. Now, just as for the U.S., there's lots of signs here in Oregon that the recession has come to an end. First, the Oregon economy definitely follows the U.S. economy. The data clearly shows that Oregon participated in every U.S. recession and recovery. Maybe not exactly at the same time or in the same magnitude, but the timing is close enough. Now, economic indicators, such as Tim Dewey's University of Oregon Leading Index, the Philadelphia Federal Reserve State Coincident Index, and my own office's Oregon Index of Leading Indicators, all point to a turning point and thus an end to this recession. Now, Oregon's unemployment rate, it's also stabilized over the last 6 months, and our job loss rate has greatly slowed since last April. We're seeing average work hours in manufacturing. They've recently increased, but still well below expansionary periods. And publicly traded companies that have substantial ties to Oregon have shown improvement in their stock prices. So, if the recession has ended in Oregon, why do we feel so lousy? Well, let me try an analogy, which is better than an economist trying an assumption. If you are grossly, say, overweight, you don't feel very good. Even short walks leave you out of breath. Bending over is near impossible. So you go on a diet and you lose 5 pounds. How do you feel? You're still short of breath. Bending over is still a problem. You're definitely on the right track, but you haven't lost enough weight yet to be in that feel-good range. Well, the economy has just turned the corner, and we have a ways to go before we reach that feel-good range of a recovery. As in the last recession, we expect this to be a jobless recovery. Now, this term does not mean that the economy will completely recover with no job hiring. It just means that the job market is going to be one of the last parts of the economy that's going to be pulled up by the expansion that is coming. Now, there's a couple of reasons for this. First, we look at history. Recessions which have a financial meltdown at their core tend to take longer to recover. Second, there does not appear to be any one sector that will exhibit this type of strength and rapid growth that will help spur a rapid recovery time. For example, even though mortgage rates are very low right now and affordability has improved, the housing sector will not be the lead industry in this recovery. Now, as opposed to a few years ago, in order to qualify for a mortgage, you actually have to show a source of income today. Demand for houses is constrained by availability of financing, and the supply has been increased through foreclosures and previous overbuilding. Financing also for developers is also constrained and likely to continue to be difficult as the housing market begins to improve. So, Oregon housing market will come out of its slump, but not this year. Will consumers be the group leading us out of the way? Well, for the time being, consumers have seen the light and they're reborn. Avarice, materialism, excess wealth is so passé. Besides, who is going to lend the consumer money to overspend? And the house ATM machine has canceled their debit card. Now, I'm not in the camp that believes this is a fundamental change in consumer behavior. I think this is more of a fashion fad, and it will fade over time. Pent-up demand will start to be unleashed. Cash for clunkers, first-time home buyers tax credits do show that consumers will spend if given the right incentives. Now, my father was a child during the Great Depression, and he always talked a good line about saving, but he definitely was a closet spender. So, our move out of chic frugalness is not going to happen this year. Now, because there is not a strong surge of demand in the Oregon economy, we should expect also for Oregon a jobless recovery. Note that many places that have had laid-off workers and the workers that do remain are generally on reduced hours or on furloughs. As business picks up, these existing workers will have increased work hours, fewer furlough days, before the business really starts thinking about hiring. As business improves, these same existing workers may go to overtime, and hiring may start with temporary help. Only after the recovery is truly believed to have staying power will businesses venture thoughts of expansion and thus permanent full-time hiring. So our view for job growth to return to Oregon, in that the job growth will be back in the second quarter of this year, but the job growth is going to be very mild. Our numbers have a yearly average decline for jobs this year compared to 2009, even though we project positive job growth for the second quarter through the end of this year. The reason for the yearly average decline is because the job growth is too mild to pull the entire year average into the positive territory. But as we do enter 2011, job growth will pick up and should be in around the 2% positive range. So what sectors should we expect will most likely add jobs first? We expect most sectors to mildly improve in 2010, with the following sectors possibly better than the other sectors. And hopefully I've covered myself with enough qualifiers there. Professional and business services, healthcare services, computer and electronic products, and retail. And don't be surprised if we see financial services also improving in 2010 a bit faster than other sectors. Still, it's going to be very tough on the near horizon for jobs in the wood products industry and also in construction. Government employment is going to get a boost temporarily in 2010 from the hiring of census workers, but this sector typically lags the private employment sector by 1 to 2 years, setting up 2010 as a very weak job period for government employment. Now, all forecasts have risks, and our outlook for the Oregon economy has both up and down risks. That is, the actual outcome could be either stronger or weaker than the current projections. Now, here are some risks which are not unique to Oregon, but nonetheless could alter the Oregon forecast. First is the Federal Reserve exit strategies. How will they handle inflation? We were very worried about inflation, by the way, back in the summer 2008 when oil prices were hitting all-time highs. Then in early 2009, we worried about the opposite, deflation, and if our economy was going to mirror the image of Japan. Well, we're back now to worrying about inflation, but this time not from supply shocks, but from too strong demand. In the sense that with all these rescue packages that are out there, will the economy possibly take off like a rocket? But will the Federal Reserve be too late to undo these rescue packages and raise interest rates to slow the economy? Now, personally, I'm less worried about this because labor has not been able to come to the table and get higher wages. Unless labor can increase their incomes, inflation cannot be sustainable. And I believe this is at least true through 2011. Now, on the flip side, if inflation does start to creep up, will the Federal Reserve overreact and raise interest rates too soon, choking off the recovery. So exit strategies will have to be carefully engineered in time to avoid either of these problems. Housing also appears to be still rather fragile. And commercial real estate was definitely a latecomer to this recession. The health of smaller regional banks may be challenged in the months ahead because of this. And now, at least there are some signs in the housing market, although at times these signs are conflicting. There seems to be more positive news that it has reached a bottom. And I don't believe this sector is poised for another crash. But it could be more sluggish than what we're looking at, and thus slow down even an already mild recovery. H1N1. The flu strain is definitely looking a lot weaker than first advertised. Still, I think it's worth keeping an eye on. By the way, if you're traveling through Iowa, do not say swine flu. I did that, and I was reprimanded for it. Now, export markets could be, rather than a downside risk, could be an upside risk. Oregon exports came crashing down at the end of 2008. For the first 9 months of 2009, though, Oregon exports are down 30.3% compared to the same period a year ago, or what we call year over year. But from the low point of exports coming down, which was the first quarter of 2009, Oregon exports have crept back up by 22.6% through the third quarter of 2009. Now, if we look at the largest category of exports, which is computer electronic products, this sector is up 56.1% from the low point of the first quarter of 2009. Still not at pre-recession levels, but it is closing in on it. Now, if Pacific Rim economies come out of this recession faster than what we're projecting, we may see a boost, especially to our manufacturing sectors, related to increased exports. Now, we also have two cyclical boosts to the economy that will wind down next year. The stimulus packages still have a good amount of money to be spent in the state this year. Also, businesses are in what we call an inventory cycle that will increase orders in 2010. Businesses had been cutting output, and they've been letting inventories of parts and supplies dwindle to almost nothing. Even though they are operating at a reduced level, they still need parts and supplies to produce their goods. So inventory ordering is picking up a bit to replenish operating needs. But the inventory cycle, the stimulus packages, they are going to wind down. So once these sort of battery cables are taken off the engine, will the engine still run on its own? Now, I'm in the camp that believes the engine will run on its own, maybe not as strong at first, but I don't see it shutting down. So, our general view to this. The recession is over in Oregon, but the feel-good part of the recovery is sometime late this year or in 2011. A jobless recovery that will take until 2013 before Oregon regains the same level of employment before the recession began in late 2007, or taking about 5.5 years. What have we learned from this experience? Well, as a nation, we've been on extended installment plans. The short-term installment plan was the financial system. A Ponzi scam by any other name, the payments came due and we couldn't pay. The long-term installment plan is the environment. Hopefully the results of the short-term installment plan will influence our thinking about the long-term installment plan. Now, economists tend to talk a lot about efficiencies. There is technical efficiency, which relates to the most efficient use of resources in sort of an engineering or managerial sense. But once you gain technical efficiency, then you should strive for economic efficiency. You can technically produce the same product with different combinations of labor and capital, but the economic efficient combination will depend on the relative prices of labor and capital. Many of the reasons for production to move offshore are related to the relative cheaper price of labor overseas. But I would say there also is a third efficiency that could be called social efficiency. Some people might refer to this as social welfare, equity, social costs and benefits. Basically, it's the need to value the non-market items of our earth and our people and bring these factors into our achievement of efficiency. We will need these measures as payments will be coming due on the long-term installment plan. And hopefully, we will start overusing another S word besides sustainability, the S word society. What specifically has Oregon learned? With our present tax system, wild swings are the norm, not the exception. We had the beginnings of rainy day funds to face this downturn, but in the end, they were not enough. I will not comment on measures 66 and 67, and I am not allowed in a public setting to give an indication of advocacy either for or against. If any of you perceive this, it's in your imagination. What I can say, since it is not on any ballots or bills during a legislative session, what Oregon has learned is that we cannot and should not delay reforming the kicker toward the goal of adequate rainy day funds. And thank you.
Well, that was interesting. Tom, remind me not to speak after you again. You've clearly been reading my blog and stealing my jokes. And I say that, and I understand because there's two economists, we're supposed to have three opinions, and it is a bit challenging after that speech because, and I suspected this was going to occur, that Tom and I have very similar views on where we are at this point in the economy. Is that no matter how many times we hear people say, well, we can't possibly be out of recession, the data keeps telling us that, in fact, we have made some sort of cyclical transition out of recession and into an expansion phase. And I put that date at September 1st, but we won't get too worried about the details there. Clearly, we've made that transition point, and we are an expanding economy. And the issue that really resonates, I think, with the public is the question about when are we going to get the jobs that would typically come along with a recession. And this becomes the challenge because it's simply the case that the lag between when the recession ends and when significant job growth has occurred seems to have been extending in the last two recessions, and so many economists think that pattern is going to hold itself going forward. And so as we have this expansion, we're certainly seeing a lag in the job market issue. So getting beyond that, thinking about what are the risks to the latter part of the year, not so much the cyclical rebound. The cyclical rebound, I think, is real, and the cyclical rebound is in part driven by inventory correction. I think we're already seeing some of the pent-up demand that Tom described. It's certainly some firms and some individuals put off spending, and as the recession has eased, they've started to bring that spending back to the table. Consumer spending growth is growing. The economy is growing. Firm spending growth is going. None of those things are happening as quickly as we would like to see to generate strong job growth. And we have another problem clouding the future, and that is what's going to be left over with the recession, what's going to be left over the expansion as fiscal and monetary stimulus ease during the first part of this year. So when we look into this year, we sort of see the beginnings of a good trajectory, but with this big cloud on the future. I'm a bit more pessimistic, I think, about the sustainability of the recovery without these special factors, of monetary and fiscal stimulus. What resonates in my mind whenever I look at the data of the past 10 years is that the last two booms had a significant element in them that sometimes gets overlooked in the cyclical dynamics. And that significant element was two asset price bubbles. First, the stock market bubble, which came on the back of a real change in productivity, but yet still evolved into being an asset price bubble in technology stocks. We didn't really recover or begin to recover from that bubble until we pulled up another bubble, and that was the housing market bubble. And that helped fuel spending growth. It helped fuel job growth, particularly in sectors that were specifically related to those fields. That troubles me. That troubles me because the U.S. economy seems to have been very dependent upon those activities over the last 2 years, the last decade, the last two cycles, to sustain a rapid level of job growth that was enough to bring down unemployment. Lacking that bubble, I think we should be somewhat concerned about what the future lies for us, whether the pace of growth is really going to be what we've come to expect over the past decade. So it's sort of a good news, bad news situation. Is yes, out of the recession, and I think it's unlikely that we double dip into another recession. I think the growth rate slows as we pull back these monetary and fiscal policy, but I think we definitely slow, and I think there's some question about where we head after that without an asset price bubble to sustain us. The other question that I have when I look at the Oregon economy and when I look at Portland economy specifically is, as we come out of this recession, where are we going to be headed? Because Oregon was sustained on 2 asset price bubbles just as everywhere else was. Certainly the tech boom in the 1990s gave a boost of life to much of the Oregon economy, and also the housing market boom certainly gave a boost of life to the Oregon economy. And so where do we see that? We can see that in the Pearl District. We can see that in Bend. We can see that in other places where certainly these were events that were tied to these booms. Now, I've kind of been looking at some data, and this is data points that I think some people have been challenged when I give them. They sort of become question whether this could be really true. So when I look at per capita income, this chart jumped out at me one day. And if I look at the Seattle metropolitan service area, in 1961, Seattle had per capita income that was about 116% of the national average. In 2007, Seattle had per capita income that was about 128% of the national average, 12 percentage point increase. The Portland MSA, over that same period, went from 105% of the national average to 101% of the national average, which means that for this region, we did not sort of keep up with what we would think of as a pure competitor type city. And it's not just Seattle. You see this trend through a wide range of cities. If you look at Seattle, if you look at Austin, if you look at Minneapolis, if you look at Denver, cities that aren't terribly larger, at least the core cities, than Portland, and you start to say, why aren't wages here growing as quickly as in these other regions? Right? We've certainly heard a lot about how well we've been growing and how the quality of that growth is supposedly good, but it just doesn't seem to be there in the data. If I look at average wages, Seattle MSA in 1969, 112% of national average. In 2008, 120% of national average. Portland MSA, 102% in 69, 2008, 100%. Right? Basically no change relative to the nation, whereas these other areas have simply had better, more sustainable wage growth than our area. And I'll give you another one. Austin MSA, 1969, 81% of the national average for average wages. 2008, 105% of national average. Right? Significant increase over that period of time. Median family income, City of Seattle, according to the Census Bureau, $88,016. City of Portland, $64,193. $22,000 difference, $24,000 difference. Education, City of Seattle, percentage BA or higher, 53.8%. Portland City, BA or higher, 39.6%. So when I look into our future, I become concerned about some of the trends that we've sort of pulled ourselves along. And not only that, but I become concerned that we don't recognize some of these trends. That in fact, economic activity is not increasing in the region as much as we believe. And certainly not as much as we should expect for a major metropolitan area. And this is a problem not just in this region, but I see this in a number of Portland, Oregon regions, but certainly this is the biggest region. And I would hope and expect actually better numbers relative to the national average than we've seen. So what I would start to think about, or what I would say as I look into this data, is do we care? Are we worried about this? Because it could be argued, quite frankly, that as we look into this future, that in fact being along the average is just fine. Maybe that's what we want. Maybe that's what we need. Right? Maybe we, though, are more worried that these are trends that have sustained really put us at a disadvantage relative to other cities when we think about attracting new jobs, when we think about attracting new persons. Right? I think these are challenges. And what I think makes this challenge even more pressing as we look into this next decade is the concern that I just brought up, that we've been able to live off the backs of two bubbles. That we've been able to sort of pull ourselves along on the back of a housing bubble, and pulled ourselves along on the back of the tech bubble. But our trends out of those were not as strong as I would hope. So if we don't have that next bubble, where are we going to put ourselves, where are we going to pull ourselves along? Right? What is the back that we're going to be able to ride? And I'm not sure that we're putting enough effort into really thinking about that question rather than putting our effort into saying, you know what, we rest on our laurels as the top 10 city in this list and this list and this list, right? Without worrying about where are we doing as far as the economic opportunities we're providing all of our citizens. I mean, of course, I worry about this when I also look into the state situation over the next decade, whether or not the state will have the revenue growth it needs to provide the vital services that we seem to be losing at a relatively steady pace over the past decade or 2 decades. I think that becomes a challenge as we look forward. I think we need the wage growth, the revenue growth, the wage growth to support that revenue growth looking to this next decade. So I guess my message today is twofold. Is one, the recession is over, and I'm quite pleased with that. And I think that we look through this year, I don't see a real good possibility. There's always the risks that Tom talked about, but I don't think those are high risks of re-entering into recession. I think your more likely situation is relatively tepid growth later in the year and relatively weak job growth until maybe sometime in 2011 or maybe even late 2011. That, I think, is a pretty good basic outlook for the cyclical dynamics. What I'm more worried about is, again, looking about the past. And have we been able to make the improvements in wages, the improvements in jobs, the improvements in economic well-being of our citizens over this past decade, and what we expect in the future decade. And that's my outlook. I think I'm a couple minutes early, but please, thank you.
The first question for our speaker, as always, will be from our City Club host. Our host today is City Club Governor Barnes Ellis. Barnes is a partner of the law firm of Stoll Reeves, where he practices business litigation. Barnes previously served as a member of the City Club Board of Governors in the 1970s and has served on 2 City Club study committees relating to city governance. Barnes?
Well, I guess I understand better now why they call economics the dismal science. So, Tim and Tom, the question I want to ask is not intended to be a criticism of either of you individually, but relates to the economics profession more generally. It is clear that one of the consequences of the 2008 financial market meltdown is a sense of serious disillusionment on the part of many of us. Those of us who took economics courses in the 50s and 60s, and we all read Paul Samuelson's textbook, we felt assured that with proper application of Federal Reserve Board monetary policies and Keynesian fiscal management, the boom-bust capitalist cycle was under control. And then in the 80s and 90s, we took great heart at the Milton Friedman, Alan Greenspan, Chicago School confident assurances that markets were efficient and self-correcting. So when no economist predicted in advance the financial market collapse of 2008, but it happened anyway, we felt disillusioned. So my question is this. In light of those events, why should we ever trust you economists again?
Clearly, the answer is you shouldn't. So, do you have a spectacular answer for this one? It's clearly the case that some ideologically driven thought was moving through our regulatory institutions over the last decade, or more like 25 years. And it became, I think, very common among regulators to believe that the market knows best. And I think now we question that outcome with respect to particularly financial regulation, that maybe, in fact, the lack of proper regulation is as much a problem as too much regulation, and that we're swinging across a pendulum to a more accurate regulatory position. From that perspective, as far as whether economists saw the issue, I think many economists did say, wait a second, it does look like there's a housing bubble, and wait a second, it looks like this is tied to excessive debt creation, and wait a second, shouldn't that fall back on the financial system somehow? But those warnings, I do believe, were more on the outside than on the mainstream of the profession.
Yeah, so, every social system that's put together is made up because of people decided a particular system would happen. And in constructing these systems, they all have impurities. I think market systems work very, very well, but they do have impurities to them. And you need to have the rules of the game, sort of setting the ground rules as to how this game should be played. And I think, just as Tim said, we sort of let those rules go to the wayside and felt that markets were very efficient. By the way, you said that we found that they weren't efficient or self-correcting. The self-correcting part still holds. But the efficient part is probably not true. So I would say, just as Tim said, I was, for example, forecasting a drop in the housing market, and I started that in basically late 2006, early 2007, and as most forecasters know, if you stick to a forecast long enough, it will come true. And eventually that did happen, but the forces were there. It just took an awfully long time for them actually to take hold. I think the one that surprised the economics profession more so, though, was the very, very rapid collapse of sort of the cards, house of cards on the financial side. And, but I will say that in economists' defense, and I've described this before, we do have the tools, and we do know in a crisis like this what not to do again. I think during the Great Depression we learned very much what we should not do. Unfortunately, that doesn't instantly translate into knowing what to do. And so been on uncharted waters here and trying programs that we hope, theoretically we believe, will help us out of this. And I think some of those programs have shown some fruit and provided us with at least avoiding another Great Depression. So I trust us.
We will now take questions from the floor. Asking questions at Friday Forums is a privilege of City Club membership. Please identify yourself as a club member and ask your question in 30 seconds or less.
David Wu, City Club member, and I've got an easy question for our economist friends. To speculate on the potential effects of Chinese economic collapse. There are recent newspaper articles saying that the banking system in China cannot sustain its economy. I think there are probably at least 3 reasons to suspect it's not sustainable. It's not environmentally sustainable. The almost predatory practices in exports are politically unsustainable. And the banking system may be too weak for the size of the economy, as some newspapers have speculated. If the second largest economy in the world tanks, what does that do to the developed world, and what does that do to the undeveloped world as we try to recover?
Well, it's certainly the case that we're counting on a strong global growth to help support the global recovery from this financial crisis. And anything that interferes with that is certainly going to set us back significantly in some cases. And I think that most people are counting to a large extent that China will be a driver of demand growth for the world going forward. And a faltering of that certainly leaves us with a big hole in demand in the global economy. And that would be, I think, a significant challenge for the global economy to work itself through. And it's something that certainly is on the radar, I think, with a number of certainly financial analysts who are currently concerned that China is already overheating and will have to withdraw fiscal monetary stimulus, in which they seem to be on that course already, even as the questions about the sustainability of the overall recovery still remain in place. So this is a question mark for our future.
I'd agree. Right now, China is either number one or number two largest exporting destination for Oregon products and services. And if China would have a horrible collapse, definitely that would impact us here in Oregon and probably throw off a recovery. It's that, I think, big of a factor.
Mark Chubb, City Club member. My question is primarily directed to Tom, but I'd be interested in Timothy's view as well. Tom, your definition of social efficiency sounds suspiciously similar to the textbook definition of a positive externality. I'd be curious to know whether you agree with Joseph Stiglitz's view that the principal market failure problem that we face in contemporary economies is information asymmetry and the attendant risk of adverse selection and moral hazard. And if so, what role you see for the government in promoting a social dividend along the lines that you've described?
Well, did you get all that? The social efficiency is not only positive externalities, but also negative externalities. It's the sense of taking them into account of any decisions that are made, that we have to internalize these sort of non-market items out there, whether they're environmental and also social aspects that are maybe hard to capture with a dollar sign in the economy. So I mean in that sense that they need to be brought in. But you're right, we do have at times market failures. Definitely the financial market was an example of that. And we also have the problem of for example, the too big to fail syndrome, where there's a moral hazard. If I'm too big to fail, I can go and do any policies. I don't necessarily hurt people because if it does collapse, I take a huge risk. So what? I'll be bailed out. And so thus I really don't hurt people by taking these actions on. And we see that that aspect has been quite harmful. So to sort of answer overall your question, I think if we sort of move beyond what is generally just felt as I would say business economics to what the full sense of the economics profession is, which is, we have to take into account all these non-market items in our decision making. Those are the things that I think going forward will provide us with a social dividend and basically allow us to sustain a lot longer in this world, providing protection for our environment, providing protection for families and so on. It's kind of a general answer, but that's it.
I think that Tom's right, is that we have somehow managed to acquire this perfect free market view of how markets operate. But I think most economists recognize that, in fact, there's a number of externalities, there's moral hazard, there's adverse selection, there's a number of problems that often prevent markets from working as we might optimally expect them to. For many markets, we don't care. Right? Whether the market is going to award me a Ferrari next year really isn't really the issue. Right? Nobody really cares whether I have a Ferrari or not, except maybe me. So in certain types of markets, we don't care who's left out and who isn't left out. But in other markets, we do care. We care in healthcare, whether or not we're going to leave people out or not. And we actually try not to leave people out because we basically say you can go to a hospital and have some sort of health care whether or not you're insured. So we've basically already made this choice. We've said, this is a market that we've said isn't going to work the way it's designed, and so we're going to compensate for it. But that's, I think, the key part is to recognize, wait a second, we're not really regulating for the sake of regulating. We're regulating for the sake of making markets work the way they're supposed to work. And to move beyond this radical dichotomy where we're stuck with either a overregulation crowd or an opinion that we're either overregulating or everything is simply got to be free market, right? That sort of dichotomy that's there. I think you have to view a social push of saying, look, we're regulating to make the market work better, the way it's supposed to be working. And if we do that, we will get that social gains, the better outcomes, I think, if we make those efforts.
Hi, Don Smith, City Club member. And I think Paul Volcker summed it up by saying that in the last 20 years, the financial industry doesn't seem to have produced a product of any social good except for the ATM card. But on the back of that, I want to ask both of you if you believe that or agree with the notion that the spending that the federal government has done, this deficit spending, not just what shows up in the deficit, but the bailouts, the too big to fail, and the implied guarantees behind Fannie and Freddie that are now explicit rather than implicit, whether you believe that that money, which may be trillions of dollars, that was used to create this appearance of positive growth in the third quarter, cash for clunkers, the home buyers tax credit, those types of things, whether achieving that modest growth in the third quarter so that we can call the end of the recession, even though we know job growth isn't going to return for 3 years, is worth the $2 trillion in debt that generations going forward are going to have to pay, rather than maintaining lower sub-zero growth and creating organic growth that isn't deficit created. And I hope that that's articulated enough for you guys to even answer.
Well, I would say, remember what we were in this situation towards the end of 2008 was we were seeing a complete meltdown of the financial system. And we had to pull out all the stops to really prevent this thing from spreading through the whole economy. Remember, there's one market that is the key to all markets. It's the money market. It's wages, it's selling things. That's the key information that links all markets together. And when that informational market part breaks down, the whole system breaks down. We could have had something worse than the Great Depression. Now, we'll never know, thank goodness, whether that would have been the case or not. We don't want to do that experiment. But so we're in this position of having spent trillions of dollars. And there's questions of equity, why did these companies get saved and other companies didn't, and all sorts of questions. Why is that just because they're so big, we allowed them, AIG, to do all of this, and other companies we sort of let flounder around? Those had to be kind of set to the side and said, look, don't say, okay, the ship's sinking, so let's take the crew and throw them overboard. That's our solution. We've got to keep the ship from sinking somehow. So now we're in a position where we've done all that, and I don't believe it was in the sense of trying to get a third quarter positive growth. Yes, it was in the sense of trying to bring this recession to an end, but more so to prop up the financial system, try to get their house in order so that they can operate to keep the economy, this informational flow through all markets going. And so, yeah, are we going to look back on this in history and say this was good or bad? Definitely there's going to be bad parts and good parts to this as we sift through in the history. But I don't think we had a choice. It was a bad situation to be in, and our problem we're going to have now going forward is how do we unravel this stuff now? How do we get out of it to get back to some sort of normalcy? And that's going to be the tricky part.
There are no atheists in foxholes is the old line, and I think that was appropriate here as well. I think that the idea that we could sort of just sit back and let everything fall apart, has its has a certain appeal, sort of a just desserts appeal. But I think the damage that would have been wrought across the country to people that were not directly associated with Wall Street, I think would have been actually phenomenal. And as a consequence, what was done was necessary, and quite frankly, a hole opened up in the economy, and there was excess spending capacity that had to be done, and the government was in the position to do that. And if you're worried that, in fact, we didn't get the results that we were expected, it's because things actually got worse than were expected, and we didn't do enough. You had a large pothole that had to be filled, and as everyone knows, if you throw a little gravel in the pothole, it's still a pothole. It's just a smaller pothole. Right? You need to throw a lot of gravel in this particular pothole, and we just did a little gravel.
Edward Hershey, City Club member. Tim, I was interested in your depiction of the relative backsliding of the metropolitan Portland area in terms of income, education, and other metrics. I was wondering, how much of this do you think can be laid out at the feet of a perpetually underfunded and thus increasingly substandard K through 16 public education system?
Actually, I was referring to the higher education system too, but because I was looking at the higher education numbers. What actually I was trying to get the point across is there's enormous amount of focus, policy focus on this creative class story, and that we're going to attract all of these highly educated persons into the community, and that's going to raise the wages, and everything's going to be happy. And my question is whether that's actually occurring. Right, or is whether that's something that's been occurring really in our media or as sort of a marketing campaign. And I think that, when we look, there's some serious questions I think we have to ask concerning the economic outcomes we've had. Certainly, none of those outcomes are improved by gutting our education spending. Certainly, when you think about, well, if we really do need higher education individuals, why is the University of Oregon down to, what, 9% of our budget, academic budget from the state, right? I think those are big questions that need to be asked. Looking forward into, again, this next decade is, have we really lived up to the economic outcomes that we should expect from a metropolitan area that should, I think, be doing better than it has been?
Matteo Luccio, City Club member, and my question is a bit of a follow-up on that, expanding from the metropolitan area to the state level. As we as a nation start pulling out of the recession, what factors in the Oregon economy will tend to sort of pull us ahead of the curve, and which ones will drag us below the national recovery curve? And for example, thinking in terms of transition to more of a green economy, and all that, do we have a leg up?
Well, we definitely have a leg up on the green economy areas. Once again, there isn't any straight evidence that says that there's a huge number of jobs and so on created by a green economy. But is probably a lot of job saving because of the green economy, in that businesses sort of reinvent themselves, remarket themselves, do things differently, where consumers seem to have a demand for those type of green products. So in that sense, that is helpful. I think, just as I mentioned before, I think some of the industries that are going to do a little bit better coming out of this recession is one of them is going to be the computer electronics product area. Definitely this recession this time around, they came into this a lot leaner and meaner than they did back in 2000. And so I really think that Intel especially is positioning itself quite well. We'll have to see what happens with the antitrust case brought by the U.S. government, whether that slows them down or not. But I think they're poised to do quite well, and the rest of the industry. I'm slightly worried about the outcome from the solar area, the photovoltaic solar panels. Looks like we're headed possibly for a little bit of a glut in that area. And most likely, we'll probably see some of the tax credits. And I mean this both at the federal level, locally too, being constrained and not as generous as they were before. So I'm slightly worried about that area. And that falls into the computer electronic products area. But I really think, you know, with our positions as really center for green economies, this is services, consulting, and so on that are going to help firms in this area expand beyond the Portland boundary. And services, since we're on the cutting edge of this stuff, is going to be needed throughout the world. So I think that's going to be a positive for us.
I would only add to that, my concern is that everywhere I go, people tell me a story about the green economy and how their city is going to be the next leader in the green economy. So I'm hoping that we in fact have a leg up, as Tom said, but I'd just add that, you know, it seems that every municipality in every state is chasing this same goal. And if everybody's chasing the same goal, I'm not sure everybody can have it. And there's going to be winners and losers in that. So that gets to my question whether or not our economic policy should be all about targeting industries rather than economic environment in general.
Carl Twombly, City Club member. How much of the recession was due to actual criminal activity like mortgage fraud and phony bond ratings on derivatives, and what changes should be done to prevent another collapse in the future? For example, shouldn't we bring back Glass-Steagall?
Good question. I would say 46.7% was. Yes, it was. Definitely, the institutions, what we used to call them investment bankers, they were not banks per se, but these investment houses took liberty with the lack of regulation around them, became extremely leveraged, and really just basically looked the other way. Notice that we have automatic regulation that has occurred. Goldman Sachs has moved from an investment house to a commercial bank. Immediately, there are more regulations by being a commercial bank than being an investment house. So there's immediate regulation that has occurred there. And I think we're going to see more and more legislation coming in to try to rein in all financial institutions so they're more on a equal footing. I do worry, and some people are going to worry about, well, I'll say it anyways. I worry that the pendulum will swing too far and we put in too much regulation. I think actually a Glass-Steagall Act would not be good. They're in the business to leverage. As simple as that. We've had it for years and years and years. It's just that it got abused by one sector of the economy, and the other sectors wanted to get in on the party, and they started to abuse it. But I don't think leveraging should be taken away completely. We actually need it for a well-working economy.
Seeing basic mortgage fraud, shouldn't the criminal activity be stopped and in order to disincentivize it happening again?
No, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, if you're doing criminal activity, you should go to jail. No question about it.
And that hasn't happened so far.
Actually, we've had a couple. Where's the one investment?
There was one here, wasn't there?
Yes.
In Portland.
Yeah.
But maybe not as many as we need.
Yes, but there has been. I can't remember the exact name. It was actually the largest in the U.S., but some of their directors did go to prison.
Well, we've come to the end of our time for this week, and we'll have to stop. Please join us on January 22nd for a discussion of sustainability and environmental justice. And as we close, please join me in expressing our thanks to today's speakers, Tom Potiowsky and Timothy Dewey. We're adjourned.